The restaurant was a creature of controlled quiet. Verona's breathed in the hushed reverence of old money and exhaled the scent of garlic, leather, and simmering ambition. The light was the color of amber, caught and held in the deep red of the wine that bled into 1,000 glasses. Each table was an island, a private kingdom of linen and silver, and the staff moved between them like silent cartographers, charting the currents of desire and satisfaction. They were trained to be invisible, to be a pair of hands that appeared with bread and disappeared with empty plates, their faces pleasant but forgettable masks. Alara was better at this than most. She had cultivated a specific kind of invisibility, a self-erasure so profound it had become a physical discipline. Her movements were a study in economy. When she carried a tray laden with ossobuco and risotto, her spine remained a perfect straight line, her steps so measured they were almost soundless on the terracotta tiles. She was not a waitress. She was the ghost of competence, haunting the space between the kitchen's frantic heat and the dining room's cool theater. Her uniform, a simple black dress, a crisp white apron, was a costume that fit better than any clothes she had ever owned before. It was a shroud for the woman who held an MBA from Wharton and once wielded numbers like a weapon, dismantling a fraudulent commodities empire with a single, elegant spreadsheet. That woman was dead, buried under the rubble of the consequences. This new woman, the one who polished wine glasses until they sang, was a survivor. Tonight, the quiet in Verona's had a different texture. It was not peace, it was coiled tension. It emanated from Booth 4, the deep, circular booth in the far corner, cradled by dark mahogany and velvet curtains. That was his booth. Mr. Valerius. No one used his first name. No one needed to. He was not a customer. He was a geographical feature, a permanent and unmoving part of the landscape. When he was present, the restaurant's gravitational field realigned around him. The manager, a man named Julian, whose ambition was a cheap, sharp cologne, orbited the booth at a safe distance, his face a mask of sweating servility. Valerius was a man carved from stillness. He sat against the plush velvet, a dark, tailored suit his only armor, his hands resting on the table. They were clean, manicured hands that did not fidget. They did not gesture. They simply occupied space with an absolute and terrifying authority. His two companions, mountains in their own right, stood sentinel near the edges of the alcove, their presence a low hum of violence beneath the restaurant's symphony. Valerius himself did not radiate threat. He was the calm at the center of a storm, his power implicit in the way he did nothing. He watched the room with eyes the color of wet slate, assessing, cataloging, judging. They were not cruel eyes. They were worse. They were indifferent. The eyes of a man for whom the world was a set of assets and liabilities to be managed. Alara had served him twice tonight. The first time to deliver a bottle of Barolo, a 1988 vintage that cost more than her monthly rent. She had performed the ritual with the precision of a surgeon. The presentation of the label, the clean slice of the foil, the gentle twist of the corkscrew, the whisper of the cork's release. He had watched her hands, not her face. He had given a single, spare nod. It was not praise. It was the acknowledgement of a function performed correctly. The second time, she brought a plate of simple, hand-cut fries, salted with black truffle. An unusual order. A whim. It was this plate that held her attention now. A small, golden pile of defiance in the center of the dark wood table. She stood near the service station, polishing a fork that was already immaculate, her gaze fixed not on the man, but on the plate. Something in her, the old her, the one who saw patterns in the chaos, was beginning to stir. The air was thick with unspoken things, and she was, against her will, starting to listen. The kitchen of Verona's was a different world, a clangorous, steaming heart of chaos kept barely in check by the bellowing of the chef. Here, the language was sweat and speed. But tonight, a dissonant note of fear had crept in, sharp and sour. It clung to Sal, the old dishwasher, a man whose hands were permanently puckered from a lifetime of hot water and soap. Sal was a fixture, as much a part of the restaurant as the copper pots that hung from the ceiling. He was a man of quiet dignity, his back bent but his spirit unbowed. Tonight, it was bowing. Ilara saw it first in the tremor of his hand as he reached for a stack of dirty plates. A clatter, a near disaster, averted by a younger busboy. Then she saw the sheen of sweat on his pale forehead, a cold sweat that had nothing to do with the kitchen's heat. His eyes, usually a placid, watery blue, were wide, with a hunted look. He kept glancing toward the service exit, the heavy metal door that led to the grime-slicked alley where the dumpsters sat like steel beasts. Later, on her break, she saw why. 2 men were leaning against the brick wall opposite the door, their forms wreathed in the smoke from their cheap cigarettes. They were not Verona's clientele. They were wrong. Their suits were too shiny, their shoulders too broad in a way that spoke of gyms, not tailors. They slouched with a predatory indolence, their eyes fixed on the door, waiting. They were sharks who had strayed from the deep water, circling in the shallows. The Gallo brothers. Low-level enforcers, loan sharks, bottom feeders in the ecosystem Valerius commanded. They were known for their crude methods and their arrogance, a belief that their connection to the man in booth 4 made them untouchable. They were a stain on the alley wall, their laughter a harsh, grating sound that didn't belong here. Ilara watched from the shadows of the dry storage room. She saw Sal emerge, his shoulders hunched, carrying a small wrapped parcel. His dinner, provided by the kitchen. The Gallo brothers pushed off the wall. Their movements were lazy, almost casual, but carried the weight of inevitable violence. They cornered him, not with fists, but with their presence. One of them, the taller one, flicked his cigarette butt so it landed near Sal's worn shoes. He said something, his voice a low growl. Ilara couldn't hear the words, but she could read the language of humiliation. Sal shrank. He offered the parcel. The man laughed and knocked it from his hand. It fell to the wet pavement with a soft, pathetic thud. They weren't after his food. They were feeding on his fear. Sal's son, she had learned from the whispers of the kitchen staff, had a problem. A gambling problem. A debt that had grown like a cancer, and the Gallo brothers were the surgeons of last resort, their scalpels dull and rusty. They were squeezing the boy by torturing the father. It was a classic, ugly play, devoid of style or honor. It was messy. It was cheap. It was the kind of thing that happened in the dark corners of the city, 1,000 times a night. It was not supposed to happen here, not under the penumbra of Valerius's influence. This was his territory. This was a violation of his peace. Ilara felt a cold, familiar anger begin to uncoil in her stomach. It was the same feeling she'd had in that glass-walled boardroom, looking at the falsified ledgers, the numbers that represented stolen pensions and ruined lives. It was the feeling of seeing a structure begin to rot from within, the load-bearing walls compromised by termites. Her father, a professor of architectural history, had taught her that. It's not the storms that bring down a great building, he would say. It's the decay you don't see. The slow, patient corruption of the foundation. The gallows were termites. And Mr. Valerius, whether he knew it or not, was living in the house they were eating. She looked at Sal, who was now picking up his ruined dinner from the ground, his movements slow and defeated. She looked back toward the dining room, toward the amber glow of booth 4. An equation began to form in her mind, a risk-reward analysis of terrifying clarity. Stay invisible. Stay safe, or stand up. The decision was not a lightning strike. It was a slow, cold dawn. For 2 years, Ilara had lived by a single rule: do not be seen. Invisibility was survival. The life she had before, the one where she had a name that people knew, had ended in fire and grief. When she'd exposed the fraud at Omnicorp, she had believed in the system. She believed that truth was a self-evident force, that once revealed it would simply prevail. She had been naive. The CEO she took down had deep, tangled roots. He didn't just go to prison. He reached out from his cell, and the life of the journalist who broke her story was extinguished in a fiery car crash that the police ruled an accident. The guilt was a physical weight she carried in her bones. Her testimony had put a target on his back. Her truth had become his death sentence. So she ran. She erased herself. She took her grief and her guilt and her brilliant analytical mind, and she buried them under a waitress's apron in a city where no one knew her name. She learned to find a strange peace in the anonymity, in the simple, physical tasks. Polishing a glass was an honest transaction. There were no hidden clauses, no devastating consequences. It was clean. Now, that peace was being threatened. Not by an external force, but by an internal one. An old and stubborn piece of her father's code. He had loved old buildings, her father. He saw them not as stone and wood, but as arguments. A Gothic cathedral was an argument for the divine. A skyscraper was an argument for human ambition. A bridge was an argument for connection. But his favorite was always the foundation. He would take her to construction sites, point to the rebar-laced concrete, the deep pilings. "This is the integrity," he'd say. "No one will ever see it. No one will ever applaud it. But if it fails, the whole beautiful, soaring thing comes crashing down. You don't build for the applause, Alara. You build for the silent, unseen strength." Watching Sal, a man of quiet, unseen strength, being broken by the gallows, was like watching termites chew through a foundation. It was an offense against the very principle she had been raised on. The Gallo brothers were not just bullies. They were a structural flaw in Valerius's empire. An empire, she suspected, that Valerius prized for its strength, its reputation. He was not a chaotic force. He was a man of order, albeit a dark and parallel order. The Gallos' messy, public cruelty was a form of chaos. It was bad for business. It drew attention. It was, in the language she understood best, a significant and unmanaged risk. She stood in the service corridor, the cool air a balm on her suddenly hot skin. She could walk away. She could go back to her small, empty apartment, lock the door, and let the world's ugliness pass her by. It was the safe choice. It was the choice that had kept her alive. But as she saw Sal's reflection in the polished steel of a warming oven, his face a mask of quiet despair, she saw the face of the dead journalist. She saw the cost of inaction. Silence was not always safety. Sometimes silence was complicity. Her mind, dormant for so long, began to work. It sifted through the data points. Valerius. A man of control, obsessed with appearances and efficiency. The Gallo brothers. A liability, creating public-facing disturbances, operating with sloppy, traceable methods. Sal, the catalyst, the human cost that made the liability tangible. And herself, the analyst. The one who could translate the human cost into the language of business risk, the only language a man like Valerius would truly understand. It was not a plea for justice she would make. It was a business proposal, an unsolicited consultation on risk management. She took a deep, steadying breath. The frantic energy of the kitchen seemed to fade, replaced by a crystalline focus. She walked to the pass, where the chef had just placed a fresh order. The same order as before, a small plate of truffle fries for booth 4. He must have liked them. She looked at the plate. A perfect golden pyramid. Her gaze lifted and she met the chef's eye. He nodded toward the dining room. "Get that to 4, pronto." Alara didn't move. She reached out and picked up the plate. The warmth of the ceramic seeped into her palm. This was the key. This was her ticket in. She was not a person of importance. She was just the waitress bringing the fries. She turned, the plate held steady in her hand, and began to walk toward the amber glow in the corner. She was no longer hiding. She was building. The walk from the kitchen pass to booth 4 was the longest journey of her life. Each step was a deliberate, measured act, a crossing of a boundary she had spent 2 years fortifying. The dining room, usually a blur of ambient motion, sharpened into terrifying focus. Every clink of a fork, every murmur of conversation, every flicker of candlelight seemed to magnify, to become a part of a deafening symphony of judgment. She felt eyes on her, the casual glances of diners turning into focused stares. A waitress was not supposed to walk with such purpose, such rigid determination. A waitress was supposed to drift. Julian, the manager, saw her first. He was hovering near a service station, pretending to adjust a floral arrangement. His eyes widened, a flicker of confusion turning to raw panic as he registered her trajectory. He took a half-step forward, his mouth opening to hiss her name, to stop her. But he froze. There was something in her posture, a straight-backed resolve that was not insubordination. It was something else, something he didn't have a name for, and it frightened him more than a direct challenge would have. He remained rooted to the spot, a statue of impotent fear. Alara's world narrowed to the 10-foot radius around the booth. The 2 sentinels, the mountains of muscle and tailored threat, shifted their weight. It was a minute adjustment, the barest ripple of motion, but it was a signal. They had registered her as an anomaly, a deviation from the expected pattern. One of them, the one on the left, let his hand drift down, his jacket falling open just enough to reveal the hard, dark shape of a holster clipped to his belt. It was not a threat. It was a statement of fact. She reached the edge of the velvet curtain. The air here was different. Colder, heavier. It smelled of Valerius's cologne, something clean and sharp, like gin in winter, and the deeper metallic scent of power. She did not hesitate. She pushed the heavy curtain aside and stepped into the alcove. Silence. It was a profound, absolute silence that swallowed the ambient noise of the restaurant whole. Mr. Valerius had been looking at some document on the table. He did not look up. He simply ceased his motion, his head bowed, his stillness a physical force. The 2 men he was dining with, lieutenants of some sort, both stopped breathing. They stared at her, their faces a mixture of shock and outrage. This was not just a breach of protocol. It was sacrilege. Alara ignored them. Her focus was on the man at the center of the tableau. She moved to the empty space on the velvet bench, her movements fluid and calm, and she sat down. The act was so audacious, so completely outside the realm of possibility, that for a second no one reacted. It was like watching a bird fly underwater. It was simply wrong. She placed the plate of fries in the center of the table, next to his documents. The sound of the ceramic touching the dark wood was like a gunshot in the silence. Then she did the second impossible thing. She reached out, her fingers steady, and selected a single, perfect fry from the top of the pile. She brought it to her lips and took a bite. The crunch was obscenely loud. She chewed, swallowed, and dabbed the corner of her mouth with a delicate motion she had learned here. Her eyes, for the first time, met his. He had finally lifted his head. The slate-colored eyes were fixed on her, devoid of anger, devoid of surprise. It was the most terrifying expression she had ever seen. It was pure, unadulterated analysis. He was looking at her the way she had once looked at a balance sheet, stripping away the surface to see the underlying structure, the assets and liabilities, the strengths and the fatal flaws. Alara held his gaze. She felt the fear, a cold knot in her gut, but she did not let it show. She had rehearsed this moment, this one line, 1,000 times on the walk over. It had to be delivered perfectly. Not a plea, not a demand, a statement of fact. A new variable introduced into an old equation. We need to talk. The words left her lips, quiet but clear, cutting through the thick, suffocating silence of the booth. They hung in the air, a declaration of intent so bold it bordered on insanity. One of the lieutenants made a guttural sound, a prelude to violence, but a fractional movement of Valerius's hand, a slight raising of 2 fingers, froze him in place. Valerius did not speak. He did not move. He simply held her gaze, his eyes searching hers for the foundation, for the integrity of the structure that would dare to support such an impossible act. The moment stretched, thinning into a wire of pure tension. Mr. Valerius did not react as his men expected him to. There was no explosion of rage, no cold command for her removal. The lieutenant who had started to rise, his face flushed with vicarious insult, slowly sank back into his seat, chastened by the flick of his boss's fingers. He looked from Alara to Valerius, his mind unable to process the scene. The waitress, this nobody, was still sitting there. She had not been thrown out. She had not been vaporized by a glare. She was simply there. Valerius leaned back, a slow, deliberate motion that seemed to take an eternity. The movement was a concession, an allowance of space for her to exist in his orbit. The slate-colored eyes never left her face. He was not looking at a waitress anymore. He was looking at a puzzle. He picked up his wineglass, swirling the deep red liquid. The silence was his weapon, a tool he used to pry people open, to let their fear and desperation spill out. He expected a flood of it now, a frantic explanation, a tearful plea. Alara gave him nothing. She sat with her back straight, her hands resting calmly in her lap. She had said what she needed to say. The next move was his. She had presented the anomaly. Now he had to decide how to resolve it. This, she understood, was a negotiation, and the first person to speak from a position of weakness would lose. So she waited. She matched his stillness with her own. It was a different kind of stillness. His was the stillness of a predator at rest. Hers was the stillness of a bridge under load, bearing an immense weight without trembling. Finally, he spoke. His voice was a low rasp, like stones grinding together. It was not angry. It was curious. Who sent you? It was a test. He assumed she was a pawn, a messenger from a rival, an audacious move in a game she didn't understand. A direct denial would sound like a lie. Answering the question would be falling into his frame. She had to redefine the premise. No one sent me. I am a stakeholder. You have a structural issue in your organization, and it is beginning to affect the asset. She gestured vaguely with her head, indicating the restaurant around them. The word choice was deliberate. Stakeholder, structural issue, asset. This was not the vocabulary of a waitress. This was the language of the world she had left behind. She saw a flicker in his eyes, the first sign that he was recategorizing her. The lieutenants exchanged a confused glance. Valerius placed his wineglass down, the crystal making a soft, definitive sound on the wood. He folded his hands. And what is my structural issue? The Gallo brothers. Their freelance loan sharking operation is unsanctioned, I assume. It's sloppy. They are operating in your primary territory, creating a public-facing disturbance. She paused. They accosted one of my colleagues tonight. In the alley. It was aesthetically displeasing. Aesthetically displeasing. The phrase was so clinical, so detached, it was almost absurd. She was translating the raw, ugly fear of a good man into a line item on a risk report. Valerius's lips, which had been a flat, neutral line, tightened by a millimeter. It could have been the beginning of a smile or a sneer. He is a dishwasher. His name is Sal. Why should this concern me? Another test. A test of her nerve, of her motivation. Was this about sentiment, or was it about business? It concerns you because the gallows are a liability. Their methods are crude. They generate witnesses. Sal is a beloved fixture of this establishment. His distress creates ripples. Staff morale is affected. Service quality could decline. This is your preferred restaurant. The quality of the asset is being degraded by their activities. Furthermore, their collection methods are traceable. They use personal phones, unencrypted apps. They are a loose thread. If someone were to pull on it, your entire garment could unravel. She spoke calmly, her voice even and low, a direct counterpoint to the violent subject matter. She was not accusing him of anything. She was advising him on a vulnerability in his holdings. She was framing her intervention not as a moral crusade, but as a professional courtesy. Valerius was silent for a long time. He looked at the half-eaten fry she had taken. He looked at the plate. He looked back at her. The analytical coldness in his eyes was slowly being replaced by something else. Recognition. He was a man who had built an empire on recognizing quality. In people, in opportunities, in information. He was looking at a piece of exceptionally high-quality, unexpected information right now. Give me one detail, one specific fact that I do not know. The final test, the demand for proof. He was giving her the chance to prove she was not simply a clever observer, but someone with real, actionable intelligence. She had anticipated this. She had spent her break not just observing, but thinking, connecting dots. The kitchen gossip, the fragments of conversations, the name of Sal's son, Marco. A quick search on a burner phone, a social media profile, a public lament about a bad bet. It wasn't much, but it was a thread. Marco Salis, the son. His debt is $212,000. The original vigorish was 20% weekly, but the gallows recently doubled it as a penalty for a missed payment. They are forcing him to work it off as a mule, moving small packages in his delivery truck for their side business, which is also unsanctioned. Specifically, they made him do a drop yesterday at 4:15 p.m. behind a laundromat on Vesey Street. The entire transaction was visible from a traffic camera on the corner. A subpoena of that footage would place the Gallo brothers' vehicle, a black Escalade license plate GXL448, at the scene of an illegal handoff with a known debtor. It's a sloppy, tangled mess that connects extortion, drug trafficking, and your organization in a way that any ambitious assistant district attorney would find aesthetically pleasing. The air in the booth became frigid. The two lieutenants were no longer confused. They were pale. This was not kitchen gossip. This was forensic-level detail. License plates, times, locations, legal terminology. This was information that could get people indicted. They stared at Alara as if she had just grown a second head. She had laid her cards on the table. She had taken a piece of low-level thuggery and reframed it as a catastrophic security breach, a failure of corporate governance. She had shown him the rot in his foundation, not with emotion or pleading, but with cold, hard data. She had revealed a fraction of her true self, the analyst, the strategist, the woman who saw the world in systems and structures. Valerius picked up a single fry from the plate. He examined it as if it were a rare gem. He did not eat it. He placed it back down. His eyes met hers again. The look was different now. The puzzle was solved. He saw her. Not the waitress, not the pawn. He saw the asset. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a thank you. It was not an agreement. It was a dismissal. The audience was over. Alara stood up. The movement was as smooth and deliberate as when she sat down. She did not say another word. She turned, pushed past the heavy velvet curtain, and walked back into the warm, amber light of the dining room. The journey back was different. She was no longer a ghost. She could feel the weight of her own footsteps on the floor. The walk back to the service station was a gauntlet of silent shock. Every eye she had felt on her before was now fixed on her with an intensity that was almost physical. The diners, the other staff, they had all witnessed the impossible. They had seen a waitress walk into the lion's den, sit at his table, and walk out untouched. She was no longer invisible. She had become a myth in the space of 3 minutes. Julian, the manager, intercepted her by the kitchen doors. His face was a mess of conflicting emotions. Fury at her insubordination, terror of the consequences, and a dawning, horrified respect. "What did you do?" he hissed, his voice a strangled whisper. His usual arrogance was gone, replaced by the raw fear of a man who has seen the rules of his universe rewritten without his permission. "I delivered the fries," Alara said, her voice perfectly neutral. She placed the now violated plate on the service counter. He seemed to like them. She pushed through the swinging doors into the kitchen's heat and noise, leaving Julian standing there, sputtering and lost. The kitchen staff fell silent as she entered. The chef, a man who communicated primarily through shouting, simply stared at her. His ladle paused mid-air over a bubbling pot of marinara. Sal, by his dishwashing station, looked at her with wide, terrified, hopeful eyes. Alara met his gaze for a brief second and gave him the slightest of nods, a mirror of the one Valerius had given her. It was a promise. She went to her station, took a clean, dry cloth, and began polishing wine glasses. Her hands were steady. The rhythmic, circular motion was calming, a return to the simple, physical reality she had clung to for 2 years. But something had fundamentally changed. The glass in her hand felt different. It was no longer a shield. It was just a glass. The anonymity she had mistaken for peace now felt like a cage she had just rattled the bars of. She had acted. She had stepped out of the shadows. The consequences were now out of her control. A stone dropped into a dark, still pond. The ripples were coming. For the rest of the night, a 5-foot bubble of space surrounded her. The other servers gave her a wide berth, their glances a mixture of awe and fear. They spoke to her only when necessary, in hushed, careful tones. She had become something other, a creature who did not belong to their world anymore. When her shift ended, she changed out of her uniform, the simple black dress feeling like a costume she would never wear the same way again. She walked out the service exit into the cool night air. The alley was empty. The stain of the Gallo brothers was gone. The only thing left on the pavement was the faint, dark mark of Sal's ruined dinner, already fading. She walked home through the sleeping city streets, the hum of the streetlights a quiet companion. Her small apartment, usually a sanctuary of anonymity, felt different tonight. It felt like a waiting room. She had presented her analysis. She had identified the structural flaw. Now the CEO had to decide what to do about it. She made a cup of tea, the simple ritual a comfort. She sat in the dark, looking out her window at the vast, indifferent cityscape. She had no idea what would happen next, whether Valerius would see her as a threat or an asset. She had gambled everything on the belief that men like him, men obsessed with control, hated sloppy work more than they hated being challenged. She had bet her life on the integrity of his pride. 2 nights later, the Gallo brothers, Tony and Rico, were celebrating. They were in the back room of a dingy social club in a part of town that Verona's clientele pretended didn't exist. The air was thick with stale cigar smoke and the smell of cheap whiskey. They were laughing, replaying the moment they had cornered the old dishwasher. The memory of his fear was a sweet, potent liquor to them. It was a small-time score, but it was satisfying. It was about respect. Their laughter was cut short when the door opened. It wasn't one of their crew. It was a man named Ciro. Ciro was one of Valerius's men, but not one of the mountains who stood guard. He was thin, elegant, and always wore gray. Ciro never raised his voice. He never had to. His presence was a summons. "The boss wants to see you," Ciro said. His voice was soft, polite. It made the hairs on Rico's arms stand up. "Now?" Tony asked, trying to keep the swagger in his voice. "We're in the middle of something." Ciro smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. It was the smile of a mortician admiring his work. "Yes, now. The something you are in the middle of is over." The ride was silent. The Gallo brothers sat in the back of a black sedan that smelled of new leather and dread. Ciro drove, his eyes on the road, humming a quiet tune from an opera they didn't recognize. They weren't taken to Verona's. They weren't taken to any of the familiar places. They were driven to the industrial district, to a vast, empty warehouse that Valerius's family used for their legitimate shipping business. The car rolled through the open bay doors into the cavernous space, the sound of its engine echoing off the high steel ceiling. The warehouse was empty, except for a single chair placed in the center of the concrete floor. Mr. Valerius was sitting in it. He was not wearing one of his immaculate suits. He was in his shirt sleeves. The cuffs rolled up his forearms with military precision. He looked smaller without the suit jacket, but somehow more dangerous, like a blade removed from its sheath. The two mountains, his bodyguards, stood in the shadows behind him. The brothers were led to stand before him, their earlier arrogance having evaporated into a cold, greasy fear. They felt like unruly children called to the principal's office, but they knew the punishment here would be far worse than detention. Valerius looked at them. He did not look angry. He looked disappointed, which was infinitely worse. He let the silence stretch, letting them stew in their own terror. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the vast space. "I have a question for you," he said. "What is our brand?" Tony and Rico exchanged a panicked look. It was a trick question. Brand? They were the Mafia? Strength boss? Rico stammered. Power? Valerius shook his head slowly, a gesture of profound weariness. No, you are confusing product with brand. Our brand is reliability. It is stability. When a man makes a deal with us at any level, he knows the terms will be met. The outcome is predictable. We are not animals. We are businessmen. Our business is order. He paused, letting the words sink in. You two, you are bad for the brand. He stood up from the chair and began to walk around them, circling them like a shark. You have been running a side business, a sloppy, sentimental little enterprise of extortion. You used my name, my reputation, to guarantee your shabby little deals. You thought I wouldn't notice. I notice everything. His voice was still calm, a lecturer explaining a complex theorem. You leaned on an old man, a civilian, a man who works in a place I enjoy. You did it publicly. You did it without grace. You did it for a paltry sum of money that you tracked on your personal phones. His voice dropped, becoming colder. You created a liability, a loose thread. He stopped in front of Tony, his eyes locking onto the bigger man's, the Escalade. License plate GXL448, Vesey Street. Yesterday. 4:15 p.m., the laundromat. Tony's face went white. The color drained from it so fast he looked like a corpse. Rico began to tremble, a visible, uncontrollable shaking. This was impossible. No one could know that. It was their secret. It was their sloppy, stupid secret, and he knew every detail. Valerius looked from one to the other, his expression one of utter contempt. You are not businessmen. You are children playing with matches in a chemical plant. You are a structural flaw. And I am a man who believes in the integrity of my structures. He turned his back on them and walked toward the shadows, where his bodyguards waited. He did not give a command. He did not need to. As he disappeared into the darkness, he spoke one last time, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. Fix it. The brothers stood frozen on the concrete floor. They heard the soft footsteps of the two mountains approaching from behind. They didn't turn around. They knew what was coming. It was the predictable outcome. It was the cost of being bad for the brand. Mr. Valerius sat in the back of his car, the city lights sliding across the tinted windows like scattered jewels. The silent ride was a time for contemplation. The business with the Gallo brothers was concluded. The structural flaw had been removed. The integrity of the foundation was secure once more. It had been a distasteful affair, but necessary. What lingered in his mind was not the crude fear on their faces, but the calm, analytical voice of the waitress. Ilara. Her name was Ilara. He had Hero look into her. The preliminary report was already on the encrypted tablet that rested on his lap. He had expected to find a connection to a rival, a police informant, or perhaps a woman with a personal vendetta. The truth was far more interesting. He scrolled through the file. Alara Vance, age 32, MBA, Wharton School of Business, concentration in forensic accounting. Graduated top of her class, hired by a top-tier firm in New York. Rose to senior analyst in 3 years. Her name was attached to the Omnicorp case, a massive multi-billion-dollar fraud. The file contained clippings of financial news articles. Her name was mentioned once, a source deep within the company who had first flagged the anomalies. Then, it disappeared. The file continued. Omnicorp CEO, Marcus Thorne, convicted. Sentenced to 25 years. 3 months later, a journalist named David Chen, who had broken the story, died in a car fire. Ruled an accident. 2 weeks after that, Alara Vance vanished. Her apartment was emptied, her bank accounts closed, her digital footprint wiped clean. She had ceased to exist. Until she reappeared 2 years ago in this city, taking a job as a waitress at Verona's, paying for a small apartment in cash. Valerius closed the file. He leaned his head back against the cool leather. It was a masterpiece. Not the report, but the story it told. He was a collector of beautiful things. Art, wine, cars. But what he truly valued was quality of a rarer sort. He valued courage, intelligence, and integrity. He saw these not as moral virtues, but as assets, as components of a strong and well-made character. The woman he had met was not a waitress. She was a weapon that had been dismantled and hidden away. She had taken down an empire far larger and more complex than his own, and she had done it with numbers and logic. The consequences had shattered her, sent her into hiding. She had chosen invisibility as a form of penance, a shield against a world that had punished her for telling the truth. And yet, when she saw a small, cheap injustice, an old man being bullied in an alley, she had picked up her weapon again. She had not come to him with tears or a plea for justice. She had come to him with a risk assessment. She had analyzed him, his values, his business, and she had presented her case in the only language she believed he would understand. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of it was one thing. The precision was another. She had diagnosed the sickness in his organization from a few whispers in a kitchen and a brief observation in an alley. She had seen the entire rotten structure from a single loose thread. He respected that. More than respected it, he admired it. It was a form of genius he understood. In his world, loyalty was a commodity, bought and sold. Fear was a tool. But integrity was rare. It was an alloy that could not be synthesized. It had to be forged in fire. Alara Vance had been through the fire. He looked out at the skyline of the city he considered his own. It was a complex machine of commerce and power, legal and illegal, the two intertwined like strands of DNA. He managed his side of the equation with a ruthless efficiency. He had lawyers, accountants, soldiers, but they were all men who thought in familiar patterns. Alara Vance did not. She saw the world differently. She saw the foundation. He made a decision. It was not an impulse. It was a strategic calculation, the kind he was famous for. An asset of this quality could not be left polishing glasses. It was a waste. It was, in its own way, aesthetically displeasing. He picked up his phone and sent a short, encrypted message to Cairo. Find her. Arrange a meeting. Not a summons. An invitation. A week passed. The rhythm of Verona's returned to its controlled quiet, but with a new, underlying note. Sal was back at his station, the hunted look gone from his eyes. His back seemed a little straighter. He had approached Alara once, his eyes wet with unshed tears, and simply said, "Thank you." She had nodded, accepting his gratitude as a heavy, fragile thing. The Gallo brothers were gone. The kitchen whispers said they had been transferred, sent to manage a subsidiary in a distant, undesirable location from which no one ever returned. Ilara continued her work, her practiced invisibility now feeling like a costume that was one size too small. She was waiting for the other shoe to drop. The silence from Valerius was more unnerving than a direct threat. She had made a powerful man aware of her existence. Such an act was never without consequence. The consequence arrived on a Tuesday night, after her shift. As she stepped out into the now familiar alley, a black sedan was idling by the curb. It was the same model that had taken the Gallo brothers away, but its presence felt different. It was not lurking. It was waiting. Cairo, the thin man in the gray suit, stepped out from the driver's side. He did not approach her. He simply opened the rear passenger door, an unmistakable gesture of invitation. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. This was it. The bill was coming due. She thought of running, of disappearing again, but she knew it was useless. You couldn't outrun a man like Valerius. More than that, she found she didn't want to. The woman who ran was not the woman who had sat down in that booth. She took a breath, steadied herself, and walked to the car. She was done running. She slid onto the cool leather seat. The door closed with a solid, expensive thud, sealing her in silence and the scent of gin and winter. Ciro got back in the driver's seat and pulled away from the curb without a word. They drove through the city, away from the familiar territory of the restaurant, heading downtown toward the glittering spires of the financial district. They were heading back into the world she had fled. The car descended into the private garage of a sleek, black skyscraper that pierced the clouds. An elevator, operated by Ciro with a special key, took them up in a silent, stomach-dropping ascent. The doors opened not into a hallway, but directly into a penthouse apartment. The space was vast and minimalist. The floors were polished black marble, the walls were glass, and the city sprawled below them, a breathtaking tapestry of light and darkness. The furniture was sparse and architectural, more sculpture than seating. It was a space designed to communicate absolute power and control, the polar opposite of her small, cluttered apartment. It was a fortress in the sky. Mr. Valerius was standing by the window, his back to her, looking down at the city. He was dressed in another perfect suit, the dark fabric seeming to absorb the light. He did not turn when she entered. Ilara stood in the center of the room, feeling small and exposed under the high ceilings. The silence stretched, a tactic she now recognized. She would not let it defeat her. She waited, her posture calm, her hands clasped loosely behind her back. Finally, he turned. His face was unreadable in the dim light. "I had you investigated," he said. His voice was calm, a statement of fact. "I would have been disappointed if you hadn't," she replied, her own voice steady. He walked toward her, his footsteps echoing softly on the marble. "Ilara Vance. You dismantled Marcus Thorne's empire, a man worth $10 billion. You cost him everything, and he cost you everything in return." He stopped a few feet from her. His eyes, the color of slate, searched her face. "You possess a rare and valuable skill set, the ability to see the flaw in the structure, the courage to point it out. You are currently employing this skill set to polish wine glasses." He said it without judgment, but the words hung in the air as an indictment. "It is a waste. It is inefficient." He gestured to a chair, a severe piece of black leather and steel. It was not a command, but she sat. He remained standing, a position of power. "My organization is complex. It has legitimate holdings, real estate, shipping, waste management. It has other, less documented interests. All of it requires management. It requires oversight. It requires someone who can spot the rot before it spreads. My current people are loyal, but they are soldiers. They see threats to be eliminated. They do not see liabilities to be managed." He paused, his gaze intense. "I am not offering you a job, Ms. Vance. A job is something you can quit. I am offering you a position. I need someone to oversee the integrity of my portfolio, the legitimate side, to ensure its profitability, its efficiency, and its structural soundness. I need an analyst. I need you. The offer hung in the air between them, audacious and terrifying. He was not offering her a place in his world of violence. He was offering her a return to her own world, but within his. He was offering her a chance to be who she truly was, not a waitress, not a ghost, but a builder, a guardian of the foundation. He was offering her power, not the crude power of the gun, but the elegant, devastating power of the ledger. He had seen her, truly seen her, and he was not offering charity. He was offering recognition. Ilara looked from Valerius to the city lights beyond the glass. It was a universe of systems, of numbers and consequences. The world she understood. For 2 years, she had tried to pretend it didn't exist. She had traded her power for a fragile, unsatisfying peace. Valerius was offering to give it back to her. But power, she knew better than anyone, always had a price. "What if I say no?" she asked, her voice quiet. Valerius allowed himself the barest hint of a smile. It was a cold, thin thing. "I would be disappointed. But you would be free to go. I do not employ people who are not committed. I would, however, arrange for the full and immediate payment of Marco Salas's debt and provide his father with a generous pension. It would be a finder's fee." The move was brilliant. He was not threatening her. He was demonstrating the nature of his power. It was not just about punishment. It was about reward. He was showing her that he understood her motivation, that he knew her action had been triggered by the plight of a vulnerable man. He was proving he had listened. She thought of her father. You don't build for the applause. You build for the silent, unseen strength. For 2 years, she had done nothing. She hadn't built. She hadn't protected. She had hidden. This was a chance to build again. Not a cathedral, not a skyscraper, but something else. A fortress. A different kind of argument, made of numbers and influence. "I have conditions," she said. The words surprised her, but they felt right. They felt like her own. Valerius inclined his head. "I would expect nothing less. My authority over the legitimate businesses must be absolute. No interference. My analyses and my recommendations are to be followed. I will report only to you." Agreed. Sal and his family are to be protected. Not just now. Permanently. They are to be moved under a new identity. To a new place. With a fund that will provide for them for the rest of their lives. They are to be made untouchable. He nodded. A gesture of respect. "It will be done." "And one more thing," she said, her voice dropping slightly. "I will not carry a weapon. I will not witness violence. I will manage the assets, not the liabilities you deal with in warehouses. I will build. You will handle the demolition." Valerius was silent for a moment, considering her terms. He was not just hiring an employee. He was entering into a treaty. He was ceding a part of his kingdom to a foreign power he believed he could trust. "Your terms are aesthetically pleasing, Ms. Vance." He extended a hand. Not for a handshake. It was a gesture of finality. A deal sealed. Ilara did not take his hand. She stood up, meeting his gaze. She gave him a single, spare nod. The same gesture he had given her in the restaurant. Acknowledgement of a function performed correctly. The power dynamic had been rebalanced. She was not his subordinate. She was his partner. A silent partner, perhaps, but a partner nonetheless. A time skip. 6 months later. The woman who walked into the boardroom of a downtown investment firm was not a waitress. She wore a dark gray suit, tailored with the same precision as Valerius's, her hair pulled back in a severe, elegant knot. Her name was Elena, a simple, professional identity that was neither her real name nor a lie. It was a designation. Her movements still possessed that economy of motion, but it was no longer about invisibility. It was about authority. When she placed her leather-bound portfolio on the long mahogany table, the sound was quiet but definitive. The men in the room, vice presidents and fund managers who had worked for Valerius's legitimate front for years, fell silent. They had learned to fear her quiet voice, her unnerving grasp of numbers, and the cold, analytical gaze that saw every flaw in their projections, every weakness in their strategies. She had dismantled their comfortable, inefficient systems and rebuilt them from the foundation up. Profits were up 30%. She ran the meeting with a cold, detached efficiency that left no room for argument. She spoke in the language of numbers, of market forces and projected yields. She was a surgeon, cutting away the fat, strengthening the bone. In an hour, it was over. The men filed out, some resentful, all intimidated. She was left alone in the silent room, the city skyline her only companion. She had not seen Valerius in person since that night in his penthouse. Their communication was sparse, conducted through encrypted messages and reports. He gave her absolute autonomy, just as he had promised. He never questioned her decisions. He simply watched the bottom line grow. She had become the guardian of his foundation, the unseen strength he had lacked. That evening, she took a walk through a quiet suburban park far from the city center. It was a place of green lawns and laughing children. She saw an older couple sitting on a bench, throwing breadcrumbs to the ducks on a pond. It was Sal and his wife. They looked 10 years younger. The lines of fear and worry had been erased from their faces, replaced by a simple, profound peace. Sal saw her. His eyes widened for a second in recognition. He smiled, a genuine warm smile, and gave her a small, subtle nod before turning back to his wife. It was the only thanks she would ever need. Later that week, she was summoned to the penthouse. It was the first time in months. She found Valerius not by the window, but sitting at a small, ancient-looking wooden table, playing a game of chess, against himself. He gestured to the empty chair opposite him. "Sit." She sat. He moved a white knight, the carved ivory clicking against the board. He looked up at her, his slate-colored eyes holding a rare, almost warm light. The Solace relocation was well executed, clean, untraceable. Your work. It was a necessary expenditure to protect a key historical asset, she replied, using the clinical language they both understood. He smiled, a true smile this time. It changed his entire face, making him look younger, almost human. He looked down at the chessboard. My father taught me this game. He was a stonemason from the old country. He believed that everything, a life, a family, a business, was a structure. Some are built of stone, some of flesh, some of money. But all of them rely on a sound foundation. He moved a black pawn forward. He said, the most dangerous threat is not the opponent across the board. It is the rot within your own pieces. He looked at her, his gaze direct and piercing. You do not just see the numbers, Elena. You see the structure. Like he did. It was the highest compliment he could possibly pay, a comparison to the man whose legacy he had spent his life protecting. He was acknowledging her as a peer, as someone who understood his deepest philosophy. She looked out at the city lights, the vast, sprawling structure they now managed together from different sides of the same board. Her father had been wrong about one thing. Sometimes people did see the foundation. Sometimes the silent, unseen strength was the only thing that mattered. And she had learned that true power wasn't about being seen by the world. It was about being seen by the one person whose recognition could change everything. Authentic power is not the roar of a king. It is the quiet competence of the foundation that holds his castle up.